And good evening and welcome to the Chris Salcedo Show here on Newsmax TV. I have a bit of a riddle for you. What does the betrayal of Fox News Sunday and the betrayal of the Republican Party have in common? I have to admit the similarities didn't hit me until I saw the leader of the GOP in the House and the face of Fox News, Chris Wallace, sitting together in an interview. Fox News Sunday and the GOP both have it in for conservatives. That's the focus of tonight's preamble. When Fox pulled its shenanigans during the last election, I stated this: we in the conservative movement have defended FNC from attacks leveled by the majority of the biased press. We defended them and contributed to their success because they were the first channel that didn't treat conservatives and Republicans like pariahs. As a result of their former guiding principle, fair and balanced, they were rewarded by a large audience full of people who appreciated that the principles, ideas, and politicians that they supported wouldn't automatically be treated like dirt as they are on CNN, MSNBS, ABC, CBS, NBC. But now Fox News Sunday has joined the rest of them. Now Fox News Sunday is no different than Meet the Press, ABC's This Week, and other Sunday shows, carrying the Democrats' water and denigrating conservatives. This last Sunday was a prime example of this, as Fox News Sunday opinion host Chris Wallace cited words from former President Bush to launch an attack on we conservatives.
If you were to describe the Republican Party as you see it today, how would you describe it?
I would describe it as isolationist, protectionist, and to a certain extent nativist.
Then Chris Wallace refined President Bush's comments by injecting his thoughts on who Bush was talking about.
Now, President Bush backed off. I know he backed off a little bit later, and he said there are loud voices in the Republican Party who are protectionist, isolationist, and nativist. He's talking about the Trump wing of the Republican Party.
It's noteworthy that as domestic and international crises abound, courtesy of the Joe Biden administration, Mr. Wallace wanted to keep the focus off of Biden's myriad failures, instead focusing on President Trump. But it's patently obvious that Chris Wallace is trying to extricate Trump and his 75 million voters away from the Republican Party. He wants to return to the good old days when Republicans were the lapdogs for socialist Democrats, the way they were before Trump. As we've said before, Democrats like Mr. Wallace prefer their Republicans supplicant, timid, ashamed of their values, and always in the loser column on Election Day. Let's examine the accusations being leveled by President Bush, an establishment Republican, and Mr. Wallace there. They have accused us conservatives of being isolationist, protectionist, and nativist. When America decides to keep its wealth at home instead of redistributing it to nations that didn't earn it, globalists often hurl the invective, "You're being isolationist." President Trump made clear that the United States had plenty of problems here at home and that we needed to stop enabling the failure of other nations with foreign aid. Trump recognized that aid often didn't make it to the people it was intended to help. Instead, the aid was used by despotic regimes to further the suffering of their own people. President Trump wanted NATO to pay more for our mutual defense, 2% of their GDP, as they had agreed. Republicans like Mr. Bush had been content to allow the American taxpayer to be raked over the coals to make up for corrupt leaders abroad who wanted to use their nation's tax money to buy votes, much in the same way socialist Democrats do here in America. What about the protectionist label? Protectionist simply means that a government sets up circumstances and trade deals that don't automatically put their own companies and people at disadvantage. An equal playing field, in other words. Bush and Mr. Wallace, being globalists, assume that America must always bear the brunt of unfairness. So as far as I'm concerned, if a level playing field is protectionist, call me guilty. Because a level playing field is what most of us would call fair, not protectionist. And lastly, what about this nativist business? George Bush and an alarming number of establishment Republicans like Bill Kristol, George Will, and others, big fans of illegal immigration. As we noted in the past, both the GOP and socialists, they have teamed up to ensure that illegal immigration is never stopped in these United States. Despite the will of an overwhelming number of Americans, the reasons, well, there are myriad out there that the Republican Party does this. The end result is the same. America is forced to endure illegal immigration. Everyday American conservatives know and accept that legal immigration is a benefit to any country. Conservatives also recognize the truth behind the Chris Salcedo show axiom, which states illegal immigration is wrong. Illegal immigration is immoral, and it is bad for any nation forced to endure it by its political class. And because we accept that bit of common sense, we're derided as nativist. Amidst all this name-calling and distorting of conservatives was Kevin McCarthy. He didn't help with his responses.
Well, I think let's look at the last election. Even your own station said we were going to lose seats in the last election. It's the first time since 1994 in the House no Republican incumbent lost. But we beat 15 Democrats, and every single Democrat lost to a Republican woman or a Republican minority. We've elected more women in the last election than any time within the Republican Party. We won from Miami to L.A.
Okay, how often have I said that the GOP is a rudderless party with no uniting principles? Didn't McCarthy just prove that? Did you notice how he celebrated diversity for diversity's sake, trying to placate a left-wing narrative that falsely accuses the Republican Party of being white and racist? Mr. McCarthy didn't espouse a pro-American set of values that unites women, unites minorities and whites. Instead, he played right into this divisive narrative of the left being pushed by Wallace. And he allowed conservative values that used to be the foundation of the Republican Party to go unarticulated and undefended. Having a person of color who's an avowed communist win an election for your Republican Party is no victory, Mr. McCarthy. Having a woman and so-called minorities who are staunch and principled conservatives win for your Republican Party. Now that is a real victory. Conservatism is everything that is good in the United States. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in fiscal discipline. We believe in the right of self-defense. We believe in a government of, by, and for the people. We revere the Constitution. And we believe in fundamental fairness and equality for everybody, regardless of religion, color, or creed. We believe that we should elect leaders to represent us, not foreign nationals. And we believe that America should put Americans first, then worry about helping others when we can. And that's why Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace attacks us, and why Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy runs away from us.
Hey, I'm Rob Finnerty. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please join the conversation in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, too. Hit the bell icon to be alerted to breaking news. And remember, there's a whole lot more on Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news network. Newsmax TV, we're real news for real people.